Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This is our first webinar session since the COVID-19 pandemic has taken over the world, and we at STP truly hope you all are doing well and taking care of yourself and staying safe. Welcome to our today's episode of the STP Training Webinar Series, and thank you so much for joining us today. The title for our talk today is The Secret Sauce to Continuous Deployment Testing. Our guest speaker joining us on the webinar today is Heath Howe. I'm Smita Mishra. I'm a tester myself and a sustainability enthusiast, and I'm excited to host you all and Heath on our STP webinars. Before we get started with the webinar, let me quickly take you through some upcoming events and important updates that may interest you. Firstly, we have the Mile High Software Testing Conference coming up on July 28th and July 29th at Denver, Colorado. Please look at milehighTesting.com to review the entire program. It may please you to see some of the world-class leaders actually speaking there. And for any queries with respect to sponsoring, attending, or team registrations, feel free to send an email to info@softwaretestpro.com. Also, there is an upcoming webinar, Lean QA, Monitoring Experiments Automation, on the 22nd of April. The speaker is Katrina Chernikova, who is the QA Guild Master at Wix. In this webinar, Katrina is going to talk about testing in production and how she set up the Lean QA for more than 30 independent teams. The link is up for you to register. Please do go for it. Our final update here is about your participation as speakers in these webinars. We are inviting proposals for webinars from all of you, and this shall be open all year round, so you can submit anytime you're ready. If you have an idea and wish to be considered for the webinars, do send in your proposals. All the details along with the submission form are at the link given on the screen. Please go through them. All right, let's get started with the webinar today. Welcome, Heath. We're very excited to have you with us today. Let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Heath is a QA automation lead at CenterEdge Software. As a software test engineer, Heath has spent the last 18 years leading successful test automation, and performance test projects. Heath currently shepherds the test automation effort for the web applications at CenterEdge Software, pushing forward the continuous delivery of all software components. So now let's start learning the secret sauce to continuous deployment testing. So Heath, the floor is all yours.
All right, thank you, Smita, and thank you, STP, for letting me talk about the secret sauce to continuous deployment testing. At every place that I've worked for the past 20 years, continuous deployment has been the holy grail. It's not been achieved at any of those places that I worked until I arrived at CenterEdge almost 2 years ago. And that's when I became an integral part of their continuous deployment effort, particularly for the cloud software. So as Smita said, my name is Heath Howe. I'm an automation engineer at CenterEdge Software, and this is really about my experience there and some of the secrets that we use to do continuous deployment. So a little about CenterEdge. Was founded in 2004, so just over 15 years old. It grew out of a small family entertainment center called Palace Point in a small town called Roxborough, less than 10,000 people near Raleigh, Durham in North Carolina. And we have, at Palace Point, we have a movie theater, arcade, roller rink, some party rooms, a bowling alley, a restaurant and bar. And so that's the kind of fun that we were trying to provide software for. We've also been fortunate to get in with a lot of different companies across the United States mostly, but also in several countries around the world, and particularly trampoline parks. We've gotten in very good with trampoline parks. So if you've been to a trampoline park, there's a really good chance that they were using our software. There's a great agile team environment at CenterEdge, brought in mostly by a CTO that joined about 3 years ago. I really enjoy this team environment more than any agile team I've been on before. Our goal for each team is to have 3 devs, 2 QAs, and 1 product person on each team. And I know that's a bit of an unusual ratio, high on QAs, I suppose, but that's largely in part because we do almost 100% automation, almost. The total company size is about 85 people, so pretty small. We have about 900 customers around the world, so that's what we're trying to keep up with. And I am quite a cheerleader for CenterEdge. I really enjoy this company. I think they do great stuff, and they're good to their employees. And a little about me. I've had a little over 19 years in test automation. I really like API testing, UI testing. I've done some performance testing. It's not one of my passions. There's only so much time in the day. So these are the things that I focus on. I also really love infrastructure as code. Anything you can do to automate the process and include it in a repo so that it's always there for consistent use. And I'm an advocate for behavior-driven development. And I'll mention that a couple other times in this, but those given when-thens, I think, bring a lot of clarity to what we try to do. I'm also known for my corny jokes, so I will try to leave those aside, except for what I've already incorporated in the presentation. Then you just have to deal with it. So takeaways for today. How to version the tests with the code. And when I say tests, I mean automated tests. How to ensure confidence in your tests. How to incorporate those tests into your deployments. And how to let it go. So the tools we use at CenterEdge, our repos are stored in GitHub. We use pull requests, not something I've done a lot prior to working at CenterEdge, and I wasn't really familiar with it, but it's when someone submits a branch that they want to merge into the master branch. Other people review it, perhaps comment, or even change that pull request. And then through that back and forth, the PR eventually gets approved, usually, and merged into master. We use Jenkins for our builds. We use Spinnaker to deploy those builds out to both our what we call individual testing environments, into our staging environment, and into our production environment. We use Docker for microservices. We use Launch Darkly for our feature flags. And we use Slack a lot. Not only is it for basic communication, but we also get updates from the feature flag information, a lot of updates from Spinnaker about the deployments, when they start, when they finish, if there are any problems with them. A little bit from GitHub and Jenkins as well. All gets updated in Slack, so that is central to our communication. The other thing I want to talk about before we leave this page is that infrastructure as code. In GitHub, we have bots and flows that we utilize to automate some of the processes that we do there. In Jenkins, we use Jenkins pipelines. And again, that's code that's committed in the repo that, that provides the steps necessary to build that repo, build that product. Spinnaker templates, which are very similar to Jenkins pipelines, handle a little differently, but help define the steps of that deployment process. And then for Docker, we use Docker Compose files. So we have both microservices and monoliths applications on that my team is responsible for. And they're both things that are running in the cloud. We have basically 10 microservices, and we have API tests on those microservices. They're run in Docker containers. So whether we're building a test or whether it's being run in the pipeline, we're using those same Docker containers and using the Docker Compose files and create the test, and we run it. It spins up a database container, basically a mock of the database. message queue container. We use RabbitMQ for that. It spins up the microservice itself, and then it spins up a container for the test to run in. Those 4 containers, again, is how we run the test locally as we're building it to check that they're running, they're passing. And then in the build pipeline, those same Docker Compose files run the same Docker containers and hopefully come up with the same result. And we have 2 monolithic applications. We're only doing UI tests on those monoliths. And that's primarily because the APIs are crap. And there's a long history to how we got here. But at this point, the APIs aren't documented. They use a RESTful structure or a protocol, but they don't really follow RESTful standards. And so they can be very difficult to figure out what's going on with them. When devs work on them, it's not uncommon to find them curled up in a corner, sucking on their thumbs at some point. Maybe not quite that bad, but they definitely do not enjoy doing that. So we made the choice not to test the APIs that are part of the monolith. We just test the UI, which of course gives us an end-to-end test process if it's running in a live environment. And those UI tests are run after deployment to an environment. I mentioned earlier we have individual test environments and a staging environment and production environment. We can deploy a PR build before it's merged to master to those individual environments. That's where we can write the tests, run the tests, make sure everything's passing, do any manual testing if we need to. Typically that's only done for us to get familiar with the functionality, but then also for anything that is a one-time setting. We have a couple features in our application that once it's turned on, you can't turn it off. And that's very intentional. And those kind of things we don't automate. So after that application is deployed to those individual environments, or after it's deployed to the staging environment or production environment, that's when these UI tests are run. So the keys to versioning software with the tests. One big thing is that what lives in the master branch for any repo is what is in production, or will be as soon as the pipeline completes. If for some reason we depart from this standard, we announce it in our team's Slack channel so that everyone's aware that what's in master is not currently in production. And that usually is a very short-term half-hour to maybe 2-hour process. Certainly nothing we will leave overnight or over the weekend. We don't want somebody who's on call to have to deal with not having something deployed out to production if they're having to do some sort of urgent fix. And this is another big piece. The tests are in the same repo as the software. So those 10 microservices and those 2 monoliths, the tests for those pieces are in their repo. It's true for microservices and monoliths. Tests are in the repo. Our test changes are submitted with the software change. So once a developer finishes their work, sends it for peer review from other developers, we may, as QA folks, pick that up at that point, or it may have been peer reviewed and completed before it comes to us and we start working on it. But we will always then take that same PR, make our test changes in that same PR, that same branch that the developer was working in. And once the tests are done, ready to roll, that's when we'll merge it to master. Because once that happens, the tests are run as part of the build or deploy process. And that all happens as soon as we merge it to master. And sometimes you ship it and you just have to revert. So the beauty of having the tests in the same repo with the software and in the same PRs is that if you have to revert the software, you're also reverting the test with it. So the test is always versioned with the software. It takes discipline at all levels to do this, to make sure that the tests are included with the PR from the developers. The tendency is once the developer's done, you want to rush, get it tested and get it out. It takes commitment at all levels, including management, to know that it may take potentially a couple days, depending on how involved the test is, to get that written and done, especially around the other work that QAs have to do. So how do you have confidence in those tests? The first way we do it is with behavior-driven development, the give them and then statements, or gherkin. Everyone agrees on the scope and standards for the stories. So that's where we start. Our devs provide testing considerations in the JIRA ticket. Mostly that's for anything that's not really obvious, maybe a potential gotcha that wouldn't be obvious if you're making a change to this piece, that it might affect a piece, completely other part of the software. QAs write the tests, and they also review tests. That's one reason we have 2 QAs on a team, so that QAs are writing and reviewing the tests, both for coverage to make sure that we're testing the right thing, and just for coding standards as well. Before we merge that PR with the tests into master, we run the tests in multiple ways. In those individual environments, or with the Docker containers for API tests in the microservices. We'll run them locally. For UI tests, we run them headed, or where you can watch it run. That's how we're building them. And then headless locally. And occasionally those will show some timing issues, and we have to resolve that in a headless mode. And typically, if they're resolved in a headless mode, then they're fine when they run in Jenkins, which also runs them headless. But Jenkins has a little more juice than our local laptops, so they tend to run a little bit faster in Jenkins. But we run them in all 3 ways. One of the ways we're able to do that with Jenkins is we can run those tests, in this case the UI tests, against any branch. So we have a Jenkins job that defaults to run from the master branch, but it allows us to specify a branch of tests to run against whatever environment we want, including our individual environments. And I talk about the individual environments a lot because they are where we write the tests, where we're building stuff, where we're testing the tests. The staging environment is pretty much just a pass-through to make sure that all the tests pass in a fully deployed environment before they're pushed to prod automatically. One thing that can throw a wrench into it is feature flags. One of the things that we've chosen to do is not automate setting feature flags. And there are a couple different reasons for that, but we've decided not to automate setting feature flags. So if we have a feature flag in place that says with the feature flag on, it does action A, with feature flag off, it does action B. We will be writing our test for feature flag A with that, for the feature flag to run the A operation. It's the new functionality, and it's what we're writing our tests for moving forward. But we also want to make sure that with the feature flag is off, that nothing is broken. It should work the way it has up until this point with the feature flag off. So with the feature flag on, the new test should run. With feature flag off, old tests should run. So we do have a way in Spinnaker to just say, don't deploy automatically to production. We deploy to our staging environment and run the tests both ways. It runs the one way automatically, but then we change the feature flag setting and run the test the other way. We could automate this process, but as I mentioned, there are a couple reasons we've chosen not to. One of them is risk. It's not that often we need to do this, but it does prevent continuous deployment. In that case, it's just continuous delivery. I struggle a little bit with these terms. I always want to call it delivery when I mean deployment. Delivery to a staging environment, deployment all the way to production. So our tests in the pipelines. For microservices, we have those API tests run in Docker from the Docker Compose files. We have that Jenkins file in the repo for the Jenkins builds. Docker containers for the tests, as I mentioned. The build process requires that those tests pass. If the tests fail, the build process stops and it doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't get deployed to the staging environment and certainly not to prod. We have Spinnaker templates in the repo also for the deploys. So it defines the steps necessary to get it built or baked or whatever deployed out. And then at the end of that process for UI tests, does not apply to microservices. So I'm getting ahead of myself. After the microservices are deployed to either the staging environment or the production environment, we run the API tests through the gateway. And let me describe a little bit about that. The Docker containers that run the test, the integration test during the builds, just talk directly between those different components. There's nothing that requires security between them. They just talk to each other directly. Once we deploy it to an environment, we want security on there. So all the microservices are accessed through an API gateway. It's the only way to get to them. And that API gateway provides security, can also provide some metering, although we don't use that yet. And so our smoke tests to make sure that the microservice got deployed to the staging environment or production runs through that gateway, and it makes sure that it's talking to the live database, the live message queue service, that API gateway by going through the gateway. So just a quick look at one of our microservices, the orders microservice. This is the Jenkins build process. These are the steps that are defined in the Jenkins file. And so in this case, the orders microservice, as you can see, it takes about 3 minutes, 47 seconds to build on average. And then once it's built in Jenkins, it's passed to Spinnaker. And this is a screenshot from Spinnaker where it's deploying. And there are several steps. The gray in the middle is a failure step. If it fails, it runs that step. Fortunately, not the case here. And then the 50 seconds at the end is that smoke test that I mentioned of running through the API gateway. Once this is done, it automatically triggers the push to production, and it goes through similar steps here, and again does a smoke test once it gets to production to make sure it's communicating to everything it needs to. And boom, the microservice lands in the cloud. For our monoliths with just UI tests, again, we have a Jenkins file in the repo. Again, we have the Spinnaker templates in the repo. We have a set of build tests, which is basically a subset of our full regression test that runs each time there's a deployment to the staging environment. And what's deployed to the staging environment is the exact same image. In our case, it's a Windows image that's deployed to the staging environment, is also deployed under production. And again, smoke tests ensure a successful deployment. For that staging environment, it's build tests. For production, it's just a simple smoke test. And it's basically a simple process as we can do to make sure that that the monolith, in this case with the UI tests, is communicating with the database, communicating with microservices, queue services, all those pieces. And then every morning we have a full set of end-to-end regression tests that run in both staging and production. Occasionally those do fail, and that probably costs us the most time to figure out what's going on there. It's almost always an environment situation. Almost. So this is a build of one of our monoliths. And in this case, it takes about 2 minutes and 16 seconds. And then it passes on to Spinnaker. In this case, the deployment takes about 23 minutes to get deployed to the staging environment, which we call QA. And production, 47 minutes. You may think, oh my gosh, 47 minutes. That's because we have a 30-minute wait in here that allows any problems to be discovered. If something goes awry really quickly, we usually know about it pretty quickly. That gives us 30 minutes for the quickest revert. And in Spinnaker here, we can, within just a few clicks, revert back to the previous version of the software within these 30 minutes. After that, it takes a few minutes to spin up the old version of the software, but that's still pretty quick. And so it's a little rougher getting out, but our monoliths get to the cloud pretty smoothly. The last part is letting it go. QA has always had an iron grip on letting software out into production. At least that's my experience. Fear and anxiety are common. How do you get around that? In our case, it's communication. First of all, we're building the tests to the BDD requirements that we've all agreed to. If there are any concerns as we're building tests, building it as part of that PR that the developer submitted, we bring it up with the team. Again, almost certainly in Slack, maybe in a meeting, but typically in Slack. And everyone has a chance to have their say, and everyone agrees to or stays silent. Silence is agreement. And if we depart from our standards in any way, we're not going to automate something. We have some process that we normally follow that we choose to depart from for a valid reason. We get buy-in from the team first, and also possibly from management if it's something they're likely to be concerned with. When the process of writing the tests and running the tests as it's pushed to the staging environment becomes so routine that you're forgetting to just go ahead and say push to prod, or you do remember. I have a tendency to forget if I don't have set a reminder for myself. Then it's ready to go. It's ready to be set for continuous deployment. That's when we turn the switch on, and there's a little bit of nervousness that goes with it, but we have a plan if there's a problem. If there's a feature flag involved, that's usually a really good way to get rid of something new that's causing a problem. You just switch the feature flag off for everybody in production, and things should be back to the way they were before. We also have rollbacks in Spinnaker. As we talked about, the rollbacks are quite easy. Within the first 30 minutes of deployment of a monolithic application, it's literally seconds to switch back to the old version of the software. And for microservices, they stay up all day. Those old instances of the microservice aren't killed until the end of the day. And lastly, we have reverts. One thing to mention is if we do rollback software in production, we roll back the version of the software that's running in production, we're either going to be doing a revert in the master branch, or we're going to be doing a fix very quickly. If the fix is almost as quick as a revert, we're going to do a fix and push that out. But if we don't know, if we need to research, figure out what's going on, we'll do a revert. And that takes, as we saw in the Spinnaker pipeline, 27 minutes or so to get to staging, and another probably 20 minutes or so, maybe 15 minutes to get to production. So it takes a while to get there, but if you're in a rollback state, that's okay. The key here is that first thing I said about versioning the tests with the software is what's in production is what's in our master branch. So if we roll back production, then very soon we're going to be reverting or fixing that code. And the last thing is just take a deep breath, know you've done everything you can do, and let it go. So the secret sauce, the key to versioning tests, they're in the same repo with the code. More than that, any tests are in the same PR with the code that they're testing. For confidence in the reliability and coverage of your tests, communication. We start with behavior-driven development, and then we talk about anything we need to talk about among QAs, among the team, and even among management if we need to. For deployments, we use infrastructure as code as much as possible. That ensures consistency in the process, consistency in the builds in Jenkins, consistency in deployments with Spinnaker. and always a failed test equal a failed build, and also deployment if we're talking about UI tests. Failed UI tests in the staging environment stops the process and it doesn't get to production until that's resolved. And we let it go by getting buy-in from the team, everything from the beginning with the behavior-driven development through those communication processes, and we have a plan for problems and dealing with problems. And that's the secret sauce. Do we have some questions?
Hey, Heath. It was a great session and a great way to end your slides with so much of secret sauce on it. Yeah. Yes, we do have a couple of questions, and attendees, please send in yours. Here is the first one. What are your suggestions for a QA team that is working with a dev team that feels that dev should be doing the CI and build work alone? How would a QA get in the door and participate?
I think one of the ways is just to learn the technology. I'll be honest with you, at CenterEdge, it was pretty easy. Management was completely on board with building a team where anybody who has the skills can apply those skills. But I think if it's within your team and they don't trust you to have the knowledge, is demonstrate that you have the knowledge. Learn the tools, talk about it in their language if that's an area you want to get into, whether it be Jenkins or Spinnaker or whatever your deployment tools may be. Learn about that. Learn about Docker if you're using that, how to build those Docker Compose files. So educate yourself and then make it known.
Okay, that sounds great. How long did it take for CenterEdge to get to current state, and how were tools added?
It took 15 years. Been in business for about 15 years. As I mentioned, there were some rough patches along the way. The continuous deployment process, we were just on the cusp of that when I joined, and I helped push a lot of that through. So really, it's been the last almost 2 years that we've been doing a lot of continuous deployment. And I missed the second part of that question, the tools.
Yeah, how were tools added gradually, or which tools you adopted first, or something to that tune?
Right. I think certainly because of the time that it's been around, Jenkins had to have been one of the first pieces. And I say that because I wasn't here for that process of the adoption of the tools. But as I understand them and how we use them, certainly Jenkins was one of the first tools. And I would be pretty confident that we weren't using pipelines, the Jenkins file, when we first adopted it. But Jenkins first, and then how do we do deployments? Jenkins provides some tools for that, but Spinnaker provides a lot more tools. So I'm sure then we're looking at how do we deploy to Kubernetes in AWS, which are the tools that we use. What tools are out there to do that to help us so that we're not having to manually push them up there and organize them and manage them ourselves through the AWS interface. And if anybody's used that, you know that can be painful. And Spinnaker does a great job of that. Docker came about just as part of our microservice development, and that also is fairly new. I'll say 3 years or so. We've been building microservices instead of just the monoliths. And I'm sure Docker was part of that from the beginning. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure what when GitHub came into it, or the Launch Darkly was added just about a year ago. Was a big deal to try and incorporate feature flags into our process. And I don't know how long we've been on Slack, but I know we live there. I have email alerts come to me in Slack because I never look at my email.
Great. This sounds like a good bunch of coherent apps and solutions and tools you use. Okay, our next question is, how often do you rework on old testing scripts?
It's a standard part of our process, actually. even though we employ behavior-driven development, which provides us the given when then of any functionality that's coming down the pike, whether it's new or modified, we always try to make our test set as efficient as possible. We don't want it to balloon into a 2-hour test run. Right now, our tests take just under 30 minutes for a full regression test, and that's just running 2 tests parallel. And I'm sorry, I lost the thread of the question.
No worries, I'll just repeat it for you. So how often do you rework on old testing scripts? So like
yes,
you said, it's part of your process for maintenance.
Yes, it is part of the process. And so when we get a given when then from a story, the first thing we do is we go and look, do we have existing tests that already incorporate that? That we can just add a small piece to, or does it need to be a change to an existing test? It's a part of what we do all the time. So we're not just adding, mostly we're modifying the tests that already exist there. And sometimes we take the opportunity to do some refactoring. Most of our tests are new enough. They're not 10, 15 years old, so we don't have that kind of pain, but there's always room for improvement. So we often take the time to do some improvements as we're doing the changes that we need to for a specific story.
Is there any lesson learned there? Like one of the question is, what is the one thing you feel is your biggest lesson learned when you started doing continuous deployment?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. What was your, what is the one thing you feel is your biggest lesson learned when you started doing continuous deployment?
I think the biggest lesson learned is to make the tests as solid as possible. If your deployment pipeline is dependent on those tests, you don't want flaky tests. You want to make sure that they are solid, that if they fail, either it's an environment issue that you have no control over, or they pass, or the software is bad, in which means it did its job, it's caught a problem, and it stopped the problem from getting out in production. But that is the biggest lesson learned, is those tests have to be solid. That's probably a third of our effort, is making sure that they run consistently and solidly, and that they're handling timing issues and they're handling data issues. So regardless of what it encounters, the test is able to deal with it and appropriately report problems, but pass if the software is right.
So Heath, this is my question there, and it's not on the list here, but do you follow a checklist or a list of guidelines or something to that tune when you're building these tests, that it should have at these all quality checks, or these are more or less culture?
For the API tests, we do follow the Swagger documents that are generated by the code. It's nothing that the developer has to write separately. It's generated by the code from the endpoints. I don't recall the tool that's used to do that. It relates to Swagger somehow. But anyway, it builds the Swagger documents automatically. So we write our tests to cover all of the potential response codes. And you know, we use our brain. What could be coming from something with something missing or whatever. But that's where we start for the API tests. For the UI tests, we've identified critical paths. And that's what is part of our build process. The full regression test, that's when we're trying to change the options and verify that all the options change correctly and that things still work. And it departs more from those critical paths. But we have identified the critical paths, and we just make sure that those are covered.
That makes sense. Here is the next one. So in fact, there was a question here coming up that says, what are some examples of flaky tests and how do you make them solid? Do you want to add anything more to that?
An example of flaky tests, we have a number of places in our application where the page loads, and so the UI software, we use TestCafe. The UI test software recognize that the page is loaded, and so it's then ready to go and start looking for the objects that are referenced in the test. We have a number of places in our software where after the page is technically loaded, then there is some sort of progress indicator that pops up where some data is loaded with inside a control. So we've had a lot of issues with the test getting ahead of that progress process, where the things haven't loaded that need to be there for the test to continue. And so it took us a while to get it right, but we watch for the appearance of and then the disappearance of the progress indicator. So that's one example of flakiness that we had a number of issues with, and kind of how we solved it.
Great. I'm going to ask you one more question. That is, we do have time, but okay, here it is. So, will the test teams get assistance from development team to fine-tune the scripts in terms of coverage, or do development teams review scripts? The idea is, does dev team actually get in the picture of the test scripts of developed by test teams?
Absolutely, and that's one of my first slides. I talked about how I really love the agile environment or the team environment at CenterEdge, and that is, we are really all in it together to try to deliver the best software, and quality is definitely part of the developer's perspective when they're writing stuff. And that test considerations, it took a while to kind of teach them what we were looking for there. After we, find a problem with their software, or we find something, we finally learn that something needs to be tested, we had to go back to them and say, this would have been a really good thing to include in your testing considerations. But they definitely have an interest in turning out quality code, and part of that is, in the hiring process. If you have people on your team who you just can't get to care about quality, I don't know that there's a whole lot you can do there. But our team definitely cares about quality. They do, on occasion, they have written tests when QA was in the weeds, underwater, whatever. The developer, not the developer who wrote the code, but another developer has picked up writing some tests. So they've done that, and then a QA reviewed that, both for coverage and code style and stuff, because the developer tends to write, I'll say, more sophisticated code than the QAs do. We intentionally simplify some of our code to make it more manageable for people who aren't necessarily coders by trade, but maybe QA by trade, and have been thrown into the coding pool. But as a team, anybody who needs help can ask anyone who has the knowledge, and a lot of our developers have a lot of testing knowledge.
That's great. I think that's one of the secret sauce to actually make continuous deployment work. Okay, I'm looking for one more question. Okay, there it is. We've talked about CI/CD for years now, but what do you think is the next big thing, and future improvements or changes to the process?
I am definitely not a futurist as far as being able to see what's coming down the pike. It usually hits me upside the head when I'm least expecting it. AI is absolutely part of that, though. How that applies to testing beyond some of the tools that employ it, I don't know. I don't see it changing our way of life anytime soon, our being CenterEdge QA folks' life anytime soon. The tools we used are working. They're doing a good job for us. So I think that within CenterEdge, the big thing for us is cross-team communication and sharing. So, and doesn't apply very much beyond CenterEdge, but that's where I think our next level of evolution will be.
Yeah, I kind of agree with your input on AI being somewhere getting added to CD. All right. Here is my last question for now. for you. From your experience, what would be the best practices to be followed for test automation for the beginners?
For beginners?
Yes.
Um,
And if you could also suggest some, sorry about that, but
Sure.
if you could also suggest some books and articles or social media communities where people could actually start to get the knowledge of continuous delivery also.
Right. I think getting started is, and there's getting started in QA and there's getting started in QA automation. And I don't know what your experience has been, but I do still see a distinct separation between those two. You can get into QA without the coding, but assuming you want to get into automation, learning programming, doing courses for that, and learning tools that you would use for the automation. I think it's test project IO. I'm not sure right off the bat, but it's a tool that provides a great deal of free testing functionality through the web.
Yes, it is testproject.io.
.io. So that's a great place to do some serious testing work without having to plunk a lot of money down to do it. You can use the tools and get very familiar with some of the processes necessary to do automation work. So, and I again lost the thread of the question. There was a second part. Did I address that at all?
No, you did good, but just to add, if there are any books, communities that people could join, any pointers for people to learn about continuous deployment.
Right. Continuous deployment specifically, I don't have any resources. You can certainly get in contact with me. I know that there's a group based in the UK that has very active Slack. I don't have my browsers up right now, so they wouldn't interfere, and I can't reference those very easily.
You could share any inputs you would like for us to pass on to the attendees.
Sure, I would prefer to do that.
We would be happy to do that. All right, that's all for the questions, Heath. So thank you so much. Thanks for sharing the details. It really helps a lot. And I'm sure our attendees found it to be very informative and useful. So thanks again, Heath, and I hope to see you soon at the upcoming conferences.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, everybody, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining, and more importantly, thank you for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and for the whole group. And if you want to see more such sessions from speakers like Heath and wish to learn more about testing, do join us at the Mile High Conference in Denver on the 28th and 29th of July. You can have a look at the complete program at milehighTesting.com. Stay tuned for more webinars at softwaretestpro.com. We have an upcoming webinar, which is Lean QA Monitoring Experiments Automation on the 22nd of April. That is a week from now about. The speaker is Katrina Chernikova, who's the QA Guild Master at Wix. In this webinar, Katrina is going to talk about testing in production and how she set up the Lean QA for more than 30 independent teams. If the subject interests you, please do sign up for the same at softwaretestpro.com. And before I leave, let me also remind you the call for submissions for the webinars. It's open through the year, and please do send in your proposals as soon as possible at the given link. Well, thank you, everyone. God bless you, and please stay safe and healthy and practice safe social distancing, and good luck for all you do. Hope to see you all in Denver in July, and in these times of distress, continue practicing your testing skills. Thank you.